everybody. I'm sure most of you are thinking, how can two such young-looking lads possibly know anything about the old days, anything before about the 1960s? So we thought we'd just very quickly introduce ourselves and our connection with Bedford Town Football Club. So I'm Paul, and I've supported the club now for 41 years. It's actually 41 years, 1 day, and about 15 minutes, to be exact. The first time I actually went to see them, because I checked it the other day. I don't actually keep count. It sounds a bit like Alcoholics Anonymous meeting where you're admitting to something, doing something for 40 odd years. And it's a bit like that, actually. You do get addicted, you get totally hooked, and you can't sort of break that habit. And that's how it's been. One of the reasons I know quite a bit about the history of the club is because I've done a lot of research. About 10 years ago, I produced this book. I actually did it as part of my work, so it's quite good to get paid just to go and talk to old footballers and old football fans and people with a connection to the club. So it's actually a history of the club, but it's done as seen through the eyes and the memories of people that are involved with it over the years. And the memories go right back to the end of the First World War, quite amazingly. So some of what I'm talking about tonight, because I'll do the first half up to about the Second World War, and then Jim will take over and take you through to a bit nearer the present day. What we're hoping is that you'll chip in with any sort of questions, any sort of memories of your own. So don't regard it as a lecture where we're standing up here giving you all the information like a school. You know, if you have got sort of things you're dying to sort of ask, please do as we go along, and there will be time, hopefully at the end or at half time, to ask us a few things if you don't want to sort of do it in public, yeah? Okay, it took quite a bit of finding this, but this is actually the first sort of mention of the forming of the Bedford Town Football Club right back in 1908. As someone pointed out a bit earlier, it's actually the centenary season this year, and I'm sure there's actually plans to recreate the first ever match, which will be in September of this year, away to Wolverton. But if I just read a couple of bits out from there, because it says, for some time past, some active spirits have been contemplating the revival of a senior town club in Bedford. So the word revival suggests that there was some sort of major club in Bedford before then. But when this sort of advert came out, there was actually quite a few local clubs playing in the Bedford League, but there was no club that you could actually say that was the main town club. Ironically, probably one of the best clubs was actually Bedford Queen's Park Rangers. So there's nothing to do with the QPR that play in London, but it's Bedford Queen's Park Rangers who play down the Slipe on the recreation ground there. And when this town club was actually formed, they actually took quite a few of those players across because they were the best local talent. A little bit lower down on that, it also says that it will be remembered that the defunct Queen's Engineering Works were once members of the Northants League, where some extraordinarily good football was witnessed in their matches. So obviously the Queen's Engineering Works is Allen's, so it was a Queen's Park club. So it suggests that there's always a really good football club in this area, even before Bedford Town FC was formed. I've been looking at some of the match reports for the very first match. Like I say, it's away to Wolverton in September 1908. It wasn't the greatest start to a football club's history, because after 5 minutes we were 2-0 down and everything seemed to have gone to pot. But we fought back, apparently won the game 5-3, so it's a really good start in the end to our history to actually get the first win in the very first match of the season. A couple of weeks later we had our first ever home game, and I'm sure a lot of people don't realise, but we actually played at a different place, not in Queen's Park. The first couple of league matches were actually played in London Road. Roughly, those that know Bedford, the ground is roughly where the bus depot is. There's Focus next to it and Dunelm Mills. The ground was roughly round about that sort of St John's Bridge area, not quite in London Road, I don't think. What I'd like to do is draw your attention to the admission prices. It's threepence admission, boys a penny, and ladies free. It's quite significant a little bit later on, because after a couple of games, and the only thing I could sort of find out was that the only thing that I could... Sorry, you can't see the board. Sorry. Yeah, right. The only thing I could find out about the fact that they didn't want to play there anymore, because after a couple of games we did actually move to Queen's Park. what it was is that there's a lot of mentions of the pitch being really uneven, but they were getting 500 to 600, or if you read a different paper, 1,000 people lining the ropes for those first couple of home games. But like I say, we're concentrating really on Bedford Town in Queen's Park, so we'll quickly whiz on to the next little advert. Right, and this is the first ever match that Bedford Town played in Queen's Park. So if you bear in mind the prices, threepence, boys a penny, ladies free. Right, good old Queen's Park. We're always sort of very hot on our equal opportunities here. So the admission is now threepence, boys still a penny, and all pay. So again, I'm not sure why they brought that one in. I've got this sort of funny feeling there might have been loads of blokes dressing up as women just to say threepence. I'm not sure, but you know, that's a sort of a possibility of that. I was reading the match report for this one, and it was actually played on the Slipe, which was, like I say, Bedford Queen's Park Rangers' old ground. And by the sound of it, it hadn't been sort of looked after very well because QPR had actually moved to Russell Park, so they'd moved out of Queen's Park to the other end of town. And it said something about the pitch was only mown down the middle, and all that grass was piled high on the other two sides. So I can imagine, I don't know how high the grass was, it might be up here, and there's this big funnel of down the middle where you can actually sort of kick the ball without it getting stuck in the long grass. And I say we did actually win that game, but it was a cup match, a local cup match, and apparently it wasn't the sort of the top sides that were actually put out for that game. So we played a few matches on the Slipe, and then about a month later we actually moved pitch again, and they started playing a bit nearer the gasworks. And roughly where the pitch was, one end would be at sort of Lawrence Street, the end of Lawrence Street, and the other end would be sort of Nelson Street, Raleigh Street end, and the pitch ran parallel to the river. So it's quite a bit different to anyone that went to the old ground. If you went there in 1911, it was in a slightly different position, a bit nearer the roads. So it's quite strange actually, because in the space of 3 months, we'd actually had 3 home grounds. You know, you get some teams that have played in the same pitch all their history. You know, Bedford Town had already had 3 different home pitches that they tried out. 3 is actually quite a significant number that season, because that's the amount of games we actually won all season, the very first season. And they're quite nicely spaced out, because we won the first away match, first match of the season. The next time we won a game, it was Christmas Day, because in those days they played on Christmas Day, probably in the morning, I should think, and we won. The next match we won, and it's actually our first ever home win, was the very last match of the season. So talking about spacing your wins out, they did quite well that year. Well, they didn't actually, because we actually came bottom of the league. Luckily, in Northamptonshire, the idea of promotion or relegation hadn't been invented. So even though there's a league below, we stayed in that same league. It's probably just as well, because the following season, we won a couple more games, but we came bottom again. So it's not the greatest start that a football club's ever had in their history, coming bottom twice in the first couple of seasons. Right, the following season, it's the first time the earliest sort of photograph I've ever managed to find of a Bedford Town team. And this season, we actually did quite a bit better. We didn't come bottom anyway. Right, if you look closely, a lot of people have sort of asked why a Bedford Town called the Eagles. You know, because I don't think I've ever seen an eagle flying around this part of town. You know, I've seen seagulls, I've seen pigeons and geese and swans, but why are they called the Eagles? If you notice, there's only about 4 players have actually got the badge, which is like a sort of spread eagle badge. I'm pretty certain that's actually the town crest being like a spread eagle with a castle in the middle. I'm not totally certain why only 4 players managed to get the badge. Maybe they had to buy them. Maybe they got awarded it for playing so many games. I'm not sure, but even from the very first couple of games, they were referred to in loads of match reports as the Eagles, and that name sort of stuck. Right, if you sort of skip forward to the end of this season, we actually moved grounds again. That's the 4th home ground that we've played on, and this time we actually moved nearer to the pathway that leads to Kempston and over the bridge. So it's where it actually ended up for the rest of its history of this part of the club. Yeah, so we had the River End, we had the Nelson Street end, and obviously it expanded over the years. But that 4th move was sort of a bit of a final move, and we made that our own. Right, we also did quite a bit better then, because for a couple of seasons we became runners-up in the North Ants League, so obviously things were picking up. We also started getting crowds of maybe 2,000 going over there, so even though there wasn't many facilities, there weren't any covered shelters, we were actually getting quite good crowds. By 1914, the ground was totally enclosed. It was now sixpence to get in, only fourpence for ladies, so we've started charging them a little bit less now. We've been very generous with them. And there's actually a side reserved for ladies in the pitch, so they didn't have to put up with all the swearing and stuff that went on maybe on the other side, possibly. I don't know. There's nobody here that remembers that, is there? So, right, that's good. Right, 1914, obviously we only played 2 matches and then war was declared. So, having been in existence for, 6 seasons, we then had 5 years where there was no football played at all. And the ground was actually being used for military use. I'm not quite sure what that means, whether it's storage and it's an overflow from the barracks in Kempston maybe. But the ground was out of action, and it remained so for the first year, 1919, after the war. They couldn't play any matches there, so we actually had another ground temporarily, and that was off Ampthill Road. If anyone knows where Granada TV Place is, and there used to be the Cosmic Crane factory just behind it. Well, that was an old school, a county school, and they used to play matches there for that one season, and then the ground was back up and running again. Right, the 1920s, I'm not going to say too much about that because the team wasn't doing that well. There's nothing sort of too great happening on the pitch. Sorry, it's not the best picture in the world, but if you look at the top left-hand corner, 1922, we had our first bit of shelter, and that's the grandstand. I'm not sure the word grand really applies in this case. It's very much made of corrugated iron, and the seats were actually just long wooden planks, basically, sort of benches. And apparently it seated 250, but then you see other match reports where there were 300 seated. Another one I saw was 363 people in a 250-seater stand, so they're either very sort of cosy or very thin in those days. Certainly it was a big squash to get that many people in the stand. Sorry? That would have been on the sort of the side nearest the path leading to the river, where the big stand would have been later, yeah. Right, so at last we've actually got somewhere for people to sit down and a bit of shade from the sun or from the rain as well. There was actually a 6-foot-high eagle perched on top of this stand that sort of a local business made, and I've got a story about that during the war someone broke in the ground and they were mucking about and knocked the eagle's head off, and nobody did find out who it was, but it's in the book, I think. It says about him doing it. The 1920s saw some other changes. There was sort of first reports of football hooliganism, swearing, and there's a few fights at some of the matches. I didn't find out anything important about the football itself. It was all stuff going on off the pitch. They were taking the mickey out of the ref and taking the mickey out of the opposition goalkeeper. So those of you that go regularly now, obviously nothing's changed, has it? I did find out that the facilities away matches left a lot to be desired. For instance, at Eyrie, if you played at Eyrie, the ground was actually a mile away from the changing facilities, so you'd have to get changed, put these incredibly comfortable boots on, and it says players either had to cycle or make their own way to the ground, and then obviously after the match you had to do it in reverse, and then you still had to get back to Bedford. So they definitely earned their 10 shillings in those days, some of the players. Right, in those days, for home matches, like I said, there wasn't much sort of cover actually on the ground, so the home changing rooms was actually a room at the back of the Horse and Groom pub. And again, those that know Queen's Park will know where that little gap is at the end of Havelock Street. That's where the Horse and Groom was. And I was actually talking to someone that had played a few matches for the reserves, someone called Len Shortland, and he was saying that they'd get changed in there, and then we'd have to walk up the road, then up along a little muddy track to get to the pitch. And I said, "What, you walked? You didn't jog to get warmed up?" And he goes, "Well, no, they didn't pay us enough to jog, mate." And then I was saying, "So what about afterwards? You sort of just walked back then, did you?" And he said, "Oh no, there's a mad rush afterwards, because the thing is, back at the pub, there was one tin bath with one lot of hot water, and that's all you're getting. If you got back first, you got the hot water and the clean water. If you were second, it was maybe still hot, it might not be very clean. Third, you can hardly worth bothering with the rest of them, you know. They'd go home and have their own tin bath in the front room. So that's quite a nice sort of story. He did also tell me about one of the characters in the team. And depending on who you talk to, he either had 2 or 3 pints before the game, or 5 or 6 pints. And quite often, they'd have to drag him out of the bar and say, look, it's 10 minutes to go. And this is a character called Dowie Chester. And I'm going to show a photograph in a minute of that team. And he was one of the sort of best players as well, one of the paid players. So obviously, even on a few pints, he was a really good player. If we head forward a bit now to 1930, that's a really interesting summer of 1930. We just finished as runners-up in the league, but there was all sorts of turmoil going on inside the club. The supporters club had a big voice, and they were trying to take over the running of the club. It also had a sort of a bad sort of season money-wise, because even though we were doing well, we weren't bringing in that much money, because obviously the country was in recession at the time. The other thing, because of all the hassle in the boardroom, they'd forgot to send a representative to the league's meeting for the following season, which meant that, in theory, they might not let you join that league. On top of that, Charles Wells, who owned the land, started umming and ahhing about the lease, about whether they'd still let them have that patch of ground. So at one point, you know, we had no money, we had no league to play, we had no ground to play on anyway. So things were getting a little bit desperate. So eventually, they managed to sort of sweet-talk the league into letting them in and apologising for not sending someone. They made an arrangement about the lease with Charles Wells, so they got the ground for, I think it's another 10 years, because they're always doing it sort of quite a few years at a time. As regards the money, what they did was they thought, you know, to save a lot of money, certainly on travel expenses, we'll just concentrate on local players, so at least we don't have to pay them bus fare from out of town. Yeah, so it seemed like a bit of a recipe for disaster. You know, all sorts of things happening pre-season. So I don't know if anyone knows what happened that season. If anyone remembers back that far? I actually think, you know, oh God, you know, all these things happening, you know, it's almost certainly it's going to be a disaster season. Well, amazingly enough, it's the first time we actually won the league in all the sort of 20-odd years that have been going. They scored a record amount of goals, over 100 goals, an average of exactly four per match, and got presented with this marvellous trophy that you see on the picture there. So yeah. Actually, I'll bring the mic over here, shall I? Help. Right, I was really amazed when I first saw this photograph, because I thought, hang on a minute, there's a woman sneaked in there. Not only are we letting them in for free or letting them in for 4p, there's actually a woman that seems to have snuck into the team photo. And there's a big fuss in the 1990s when Karen Brady became managing director of Birmingham City. It's like, oh, there's a woman in the boardroom, you know, whatever next? And obviously since then we've had Delia Smith, and that's about it actually, in terms of football league clubs having women on the board. So, you know, this lady looks for all intents and purposes like the chairman of the club. And it says on all the headed note paper, Mrs. D. Spencer, chairman, Bedford Town Football Club. There is actually a story behind this, though. If I can get this little thing to work. You see this little chap here, looking a bit sheepish there at the back. That's actually Mrs. Spencer's husband, Dick Spencer. Now, Dick was actually the chairman of the club at the start of the season. And what happened, he ran a bookies somewhere in the town centre, and that bookies would take bets on results of matches. So they didn't really have pools in those days. They'd take bets on individual matches, a bit like they do nowadays. And some of those matches obviously included Bedford. So the Bedfordshire FA, Bedfordshire Football Association, thought this is a bit dodgy. You know, you've got a chairman and his business is taking bets on whether we win or lose. So they called him in and said that you can't be chairman any longer and run the bookies. So obviously he wasn't thinking about the bookies, so he said, right, okay, I'll stop being chairman. And they decided to appoint his wife as the chairperson. Right, but what actually happened, luckily I managed to speak to some of the people, or one of the people that's on this photograph, Reg there, was the vice chairman, a young lad there. He was about 92, I think, when I interviewed him for the book. And this man down here, Bob Baker, was the secretary. And luckily his son, who's in his 80s now, he kept all the records, and it's him that gave me this photograph with this amazing story in it. They were saying that they went to obviously all these board meetings, and what really happened, they'd always have the meetings at the Spencer's house, which is in Brereton Road, up by the Catholic Church. And although the Beds FA thought that this woman was actually chairman, the meetings were actually run by Dick Spencer. Mrs. Spencer was out the back making the tea and biscuits, as she always did, and they carried on this pretense all season that she was the chairman, but in fact nothing had changed at all. You know, it just sort of carried on as normal. Now, I did think that that only lasted for a year or two, keeping up this pretense, you know, and then maybe somebody else took over. But a couple of weeks ago, I found this old programme from 1938, so it's 8 years after this photo was taken, and at the top of the heading it says, Chairman, Mrs. D. Spencer. So for nearly a decade, they kept up this pretense that she was in charge of the club, where all she was doing is making the teas and the biscuits and the cakes and so on. So, you know, I think quite an interesting story about sort of, you know, stories that can come from just one photograph. Yeah, I was talking about Mrs. Spencer being in charge for those 8 years. It was actually the most successful period in the club's history, because we came runners-up about 3 times. We won the championship 3 times as well. So under the pretend woman chairman, it was actually our best sort of run in the history. We had crowds of over 5,000, for instance, for some of the FA Cup games. By then it was 6pence to get in, extra 6pence to sit down. So now they're sort of cashing in a little bit, trying to make a bit of money. And in the 1930s, they had some interesting ways of making money. We had circuses on the ground. Every Whit Monday, there's always a big fair where there's a big parade from the town centre of bands and all sorts, all leading to Queen's Park. I still sort of haven't found any pictures of the animals traipsing over the railway bridge from the railway, but you know, when they had circuses, obviously there were elephants sort of going over the bridge. There was all sorts of wild creatures. You know, it's not quite as bad as it is today, but it's you know, it just conjures up that sort of picture. I don't think anybody took a photograph of this sort of amazing sight of all these animals getting off the train and coming over the bridge for the circus. And in fact, things like that were the first time a lot of young people actually went to the football ground, was to see something like a fair or a circus, and also, like Jim said, during the war, to have it as their playground. So obviously the best spell of our entire history sort of ended when the Second World War started, and that season there was actually like a mini league, which we went on to win that as well. So we were doing well, and then obviously there's the interruption, obviously sadly, for the Second World War. The other thing, during the war years, it did become a bit of a kid's playground. Like you say, there was never any sort of vandalism. There's this one story about the eagle's head being broken off, but he convinced me it was an accident, honest. They did actually keep at least one horse on the ground as well, just to try and keep the grass down a bit. And obviously that, you know, the sort of kids would play with the horse and look after it as well. You know, so again, it was the first time a lot of kids ever went to the ground, was literally to play there rather than to actually go and watch a football match. The football started up again straight after the Second World War. And this time we actually entered the Southern League, so it was actually quite a big step up from the previous league that we played in, which was then United Counties League. Right, and that's the cover of the first ever programme for the first match after the Second World War. If you notice the prices, they've gone up to £1 now. Boys under 14, 6pence. And if you're in uniform, coming back from the war, that was only 6pence as well. Yeah, so you got in half price by wearing your uniform after the war. It wasn't that great a season, but the one sort of big sort of name that we had was someone called Alfred Strange, who took over as the manager of the club. And it seems like a bit of a weird name to have. When I looked it up, he did actually play for England about 20 times in the 1930s. He actually captained England 3 times. And if you think Alfred Strange is a strange name, in the same side was his Sheffield Wednesday colleague Ernest Blenkinsop, and there was also someone called Pongo Waring playing up front. So he didn't have the strangest name definitely in that team. I think Jim's got a few memories about Alf Strange, actually sort of meeting him. So I'll hand over to you just for a second, yeah?
When we got into the ground as young lads, The first thing that I remember was the length of the grass, and it was at least 2 foot high. But the other thing was the sound of music. And again, as a young lad, we were interested to see where this music came from. So we sort of went across what was the pitch, climbed onto the wall, and sat there and watched these chaps playing tennis and playing music. What we didn't know then, that we found out many years later, it was Glenn Miller. And he used to record in Co-Partners Hall, which was next door to the Eagles ground. So there we were sitting in the old Eagles ground. They wasn't up and running, so it wasn't 45, I think it was 44, and who should be the other side of the wall but Glenn Miller. So that was my first introduction to Bedford Town Football Club. But getting back to Alf Strange, what a likeable fella he was, because the ground suddenly came to life and he allowed us boys, 9 and 10-year-olds, to go down there during the day. There was no full-time footballers or anything like that, so he was basically on his own, and I can't ever remember a groundsman. I think there was somewhere down the line, but what we liked about Alf Strange was that he would get 4 or 5 of these balls out and let us play on the ground, and we took great fun in doing that and thoroughly enjoyed his little bit of coaching. I can't remember whether I gained anything out of it or not, but that was my introduction to Bedford Town Football Club.
The other thing that happened just after the war, they started building a lot more covered accommodation at the ground. So, for instance, in 1946, thinking just after the first season, they built the gasworks stand. Not the most glamorous name for a stand, and anyone that went there would know it wasn't glamorous at all. I don't know how many posts they were holding this little bit of corrugated iron up, but there was always far too many. You didn't get a very good view from down that side, but at least it ran the whole length of the pitch, and it was some sort of cover against the elements. 1949 to 50, there's a big sort of building went on at the end, and it's one of the few bits of the ground that's actually still standing over there, and it's used as storage at Charles Wells to this day, and that's the Nelson Street end. Legend has it it's one of the first cantilever stands in the country, and by cantilever it means there wasn't all these endless bars at the front blocking your view. It's actually just supported at the back, and it's sort of curved over. And the good thing about that stand, anyone that used to go over there will know that the sound really echoed because of the shape of it, because it's quite a nice curved roof, and it really sort of made a lot of sound. I've got really good memories of the crowd making a lot of noise actually down that end. So that takes up to about the 1950s. We're going to probably stop when this very famous event happens, which is Ronnie Rook, who was a very well-known footballer, turned up and became the manager of Bedford Town, player manager in fact. Oh, the only other story I had about the boots actually, when Jim was saying about how uncomfortable they were, someone was saying quite often you race back to the horse and groom and try to get your boots off quickly, so you got the hot water, and you found the boots wouldn't come off, and you actually found that running on the hard ground, one of the nails in the boots had actually gone into your foot, and that's why you couldn't get it off, because it was actually literally nailed to the soles of your feet. So on that point, there are tea and biscuits over there.
The best thing that ever happened to Bedford Town was that year, and probably no non-league side in the country had experienced what was going to happen to the Eagles Football Club. And I always remember, because in Ford End Road there was a greengrocer's shop called Henwood's, and I think I was 15 at the time, and Les Henwood said to Tony Henwood and myself, if you want to get your picture in the paper, get over Allen's Bridge, there's something going to happen this evening. Well, just over Allen's Bridge, I think it's where Edmundo's, the gents' hairdressers, is now, used to be the registered offices of Bedford Town Football Club. So off we went there for 4 o'clock, and we couldn't believe it when we got over the bridge, because there must have been 200 or 300 people milling around, and all of a sudden this person emerged, and photographers were everywhere, and Bedford Town had signed Ronnie Rook, a first division footballer. It wasn't the Premier Division in those days, first division, and it was unheard of that anybody of that calibre would come into a non-league football situation. Obviously money was involved, as it is today, and all of a sudden we'd got Ronnie Rook as the manager of Bedford Town. And I think it was either a Wednesday or a Thursday, because the following Saturday the first team were away and Ronnie Rook turned out for the reserves on the Eagles ground, and I think the 1,000 gate that was normally there increased to 4,000 that particular game. But what I wanted to really express was the following Thursday was an evening match. There was no floodlights, so the evening kickoffs was at 5:30. WH Allen's, the engineering works at the other end of Ford End Road, they worked until 5:30, and in those days there was 3,500 people worked in Allen's, and 90% of them either came out of the gate on a bicycle or walked. And normally everybody came out of the main gate. I've got a picture here, I can't get it up on the screen, but there's a picture there of people spewing out of WH Allen's at 5:30, turning left to go over Allen's Bridge, because remember, there was no bridge over the river down the Slipe in those days, so even all the people who worked at Allen's from Kempston had to go all the way around Preban Street and up Kempston Road. So everybody turned out of Allen's normally and headed into Bedford. This particular Thursday night, remember, 5:30 kick-off, Allen's men clocked out at 5:30, so they've got precisely no time at all to come out of the gates, turn right, and there were 3,000 bicycles abandoned all over Queen's Park just here. I mean, it was the days when you didn't have any fears of a bike being stolen, but I can remember it vividly that everywhere you walked, you fell over a bicycle. Whether anybody else can remember that here tonight, I don't know, but it was unbelievable. And I think there were 6,500 people there, and we'd never seen anything like it in Ford End Road or around the Eagles ground like it. And it went on for the whole of that season, because I think, if my memory serves me right, we had 20 league games to go that season. I think we were bottom but one in the league, and we won 19 out of the 20. And I think the last game was a draw, so I don't think we lost any of the 20 games. But what amazed everybody really was that money spoke in those days, because First Division footballers were being paid £20 a week. Ronnie Rook offered First Division footballers overnight £40 a week. That was double your money. And First Division footballers literally came to Bedford, the likes of Vivian Woodward from Spurs, Frankie Penn from Fulham, and one or two from the Arsenal. I can't remember their names offhand. But suddenly we had a virtually First Division side that could take on anybody, really. So Bedford had arrived. We were one of the best clubs in the Southern League, although the following season, I think Worcester City, they signed on most of Manchester City players after they'd been in the cup final that year at Wembley, and I think Hereford United done the same. But Bedford Town had certainly began in the big time, and a lot of you know what happened next, and we move on through 2 or 3 years. Ronnie Rook had left, and then we moved to the next stage where it was the Arsenal game, and again that was a year to remember when, as you well know, we drew at Arsenal 2 each, and we came back for the replay on that Thursday, and again it was a sight that I don't think we shall ever see in Bedford again, when most people who went to Highbury, I was one of those who came back on the train and joined the queue for the replay tickets immediately, and the queue stretched the whole, if you know Queen's Park, the whole of the way down Nelson Street, along Ford End Road, and down the Slipe. By this time the bridge had gone over the river, and I think the queue went over the bridge, and people then queued to get the replay tickets. And if you've seen one of our books, I don't know whether it was the 4th book or the 3rd book, Pat Henwood, again, the greengrocer in Ford End Road, she opened a greengrocer's shop on on the Sunday morning, and she sold teas because it was a January morning, it was freezing cold, and I think she made quite a lot of money out of teas. And I think also it went on, you could have a pee and a tea, because obviously there was no toilets, and she offered the toilet facilities for people as well. So we got to the Thursday with the replay, and in those days the ground was developing. There was nothing at the river end, or very little, and my father, being a road haulier in Queen's Park with a number of lorries, he did nothing but Monday to Thursday morning of the replay I think we took 400 loads of spent ballast from Britannia Works, Hobkirks and WH Allen's into the bottom end of the ground, and we formed, there was no barriers in those days, but we formed a mound that at the end of the day I think 2,000 or 3,000 people stood on that Thursday. So we managed to get a gate of somewhere around 11,000, was it, Paul, the replay? I think it was about 11,000. Was it 15,000? I dropped a couple of thousand. But anyway, as you well know, we lost the replay, and Bedford Town was on the map because it was televised, not the full game, but highlights with, I think it was Kenneth Woolstonehome in those days, and I think it was black and white as well, so certainly wasn't colour. So we then moved along out of the 50s and into the 60s, and again the 60s presented memorable days. It was the highlight of Bedford Town because we had a squad of full-time professionals, and in those days in the 60s, just along opposite Allen Park, down by the river, Bedford Town owned a number of houses where quite a few of the professionals, full-time professionals, lived. And I always remember because we had our offices on the bottom of Honey Hill Road and Old Ford End Road, and every morning they didn't train on the Eagles ground, they looked after the pitch more in those days, and they used to trot past where my office was and off to Allen Park where they would do their training. And it always, I could hear this pitter-patter of boots coming along, and it was my time to say to somebody in the office, well, I've just got to nip so-and-so and see somebody. And I always went to Allen Park and watched them train. So did a lot of others. It was something to see full-time professionals play in Bedford and also train in Bedford. So we then came along to 1966, when again we reached the third round of the FA Cup, and we played Everton, as you well know, and we had a run up to the Everton game. Again we lost, but I think we put up a good fight. I think on that particular day there was something like 18,000 at that match. Am I right? Yeah, guessing again. But what I'm trying to say with Bedford Town, through the 50s and 60s, we created something that we could dearly do with now, but whether that'll ever happen again, I'm not quite certain. So we came through the 60s, things started to change, we got into the 70s, and I became involved with Bedford Town Football Club in the later 70s, when I had been running a youth team, or 4 youth teams in Queen's Park during the early 70s, and in 1977 they appointed a manager, Barry Fry. We all know Barry Fry, a manager who's been in football and around in football for many, many years, and he rung me up, and this will typify Barry Fry. He rang me up on the Sunday night. He said, would you be prepared to run my youth team? Oh, I said, I don't know about that, I've got a business to run. But he said, can you let me know in the morning? So he rang me in the morning, and I said, okay, I'll take on the New Bedford Town Youth Club, a youth team. He said, oh, I'm pleased about that. I've got a game Wednesday night, and I hadn't got one player. So I had to really put my thinking cap on and managed to go around some of the boys' teams that I've been acquainted with, over the sort of 8 years I've been involved with youth football. And I got a team, and we played Cambridge United youth team. Can't remember the result now. And Bedford Town youth team was up and running, and we became quite successful. I think after Barry Fry had gone, we got to the third round of the FA Youth Cup, and we played Stoke City. I know we lost, but that was another achievement. But as far as I was concerned, 1977 to 1980, with Barry Fry around, was some of the best days I've ever had in football, because he was a character, still is a character, and kept Bedford Town alive. Certainly, I think if he hadn't been there for that short period of time, we'd have gone under a lot earlier. But he was like lots of, I wouldn't say managers, but particularly chairmen that Bedford Town have had over the years. Not that I was involved with them, but I knew of them. Did save Bedford Town for many, many years. I mean, I mentioned no names, but there was a certain chap who allowed greyhound racing on the Eagles ground, and everybody condemned him for doing that. But at the end of the day, he did get Bedford Town playing football for 5 years longer than they probably would have done. But at the end of the day, in 1982, it was the downfall of the club, because what we didn't know, that he'd sold the lease down from the 99 years to 5 years, and from 77 when I was involved to 82, that was the end of the club. And you all know that Bedford Town went out of business, I think 82-83 season, and we remained that way until again I got involved with the reforming of the Eagles Football Club in 1989, and that again was a major achievement in Bedford, because there were three of us. One man standing out above all was Barry Stevenson. Eric Noble and myself held a meeting at the public library in Bedford, and you all know the story, I think, but we got up there like we did tonight, and we put 25 chairs out, and in the end I think there was 250 people turned up, so we knew then that there was a need to reform Bedford Town Football Club. And over the next few weeks, we gave people, or sold people, membership cards to Bedford Town Football Club for £1 each, I think it was, and we had 1,500 membership cards sold, only to be told by a solicitor that that was illegal because we hadn't got a football club. And we really held our meetings down the Mill Hotel, running, I think, an illegal non-football team club. But as you well know, that over the next couple of years, we started with a youth club, and then we took on Cotton End, changed the name to Bedford Town, and bingo, we was up and running. And I know we haven't achieved probably what we wanted to achieve over the years, but by golly, those early days in the early 90s were something or other. I mean, playing at Allen Park, of all places, a well-known club like Bedford Town having to go to a public park to start their football club was a real challenge. And on a Saturday afternoon, I mean, to start with, we got no preferential treatment, because until September the 1st, on that first season, cricket took preference over football. So we played the first, I think, 11 or 12 league matches away from home before we could play our first home game. And we used to have to get up to Allen Park about 2.5, 3 hours before the game to try and transform a public park pitch into a bit of a stadium. And we had, well, my wife was one of them, and Penny was another. We converted the groundsman's workshop into a tea shop. We had to have trainers' dugouts on wheels so that we could push them probably about 100 yards to get by the side of the pitch. And it was amazing the support we got in those early days, having to get the public park as virtually a professional football club to play on. But we did that, and as you all know, because many of you here tonight are Eagle supporters, I think we won the league year in and year out, and we progressed until we was back on the right road to where we'd come from. But sadly, we've just slipped a little bit, but I'm sure that those sort of things can be rectified, and in the near future, somebody will come along and help us retain some of the glory that we had in the past. But really, that's my memories of Bedford Town from the 50s through to 2000 and beyond, and I hope it's been of some interest to you. That's my little stories for tonight. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'll just go back to a couple of photographs there, because we sort of skipped over quite an important character. The chap in the white coat there was Bedford Town's mascot for quite a few seasons. I know sort of these days, when you talk about mascots, it's normally a young kid with a replica kit that runs out with the team. Well, this man was really influential in whipping up the crowd into some sort of frenzy before the match. I say his name was Fred Sturman. He didn't actually live in Queen's Park. He lived over the bridge in Kempston. The reason he's got a white coat is because he worked on the railway. And in those days, they didn't have the bright fluorescent yellow jackets or orange. You know, high visibility was white in those days. So he'd wear that coat, and you probably noticed some of the other photographs, he's actually printed eagles all over it. He's got quite nice line in snazzy little hats as well. That's right, yeah, he's actually in front of the crowd. It's noticeable that there's three old blokes that are mascots there, you know, they're all dressed up slightly sort of strangely. This is him with the coat with the eagles printed on it and there's feathers sticking out of his hat. What he'd do in his spare time when he wasn't working on the railway was actually make rattles to give out to people. And you've heard what the force of some of the rattles were a little bit earlier on. I was talking to someone over there who said that in his spare time at work at the Pytal Works, was it, JP White's? He actually sort of run off quite a few rattles as well for the crowd. So what you've got to bear in mind, I mean, Jim was saying that normally there would be 200 of these rattles and make quite a lot of noise, you know, just with sort of a couple of them. You imagine sort of 200 of them all going at the same time. And this bloke, like I say, he'd make rattles during the week and he'd actually give them out to the crowd. So every week there was a few more rattles to add to the noise. I'm pretty certain you wouldn't be allowed to take them into a football ground these days. They're quite heavy things and you have to wave them above your head. So quite a few people did get smacked on the head by them. You know, but it's just this sort of whole thing. And the reason the book was actually called the Eyrie Roar is because that's what they sort of called the noise at the Eyrie, because obviously an eagle's nest is an eyrie. And it was sort of based on the fact that at Wembley they had the Wembley Roar, in Scotland, Glasgow, they had the Hampden Roar. So sort of quite jokingly they called it the Eyrie Roar, and most of it was instigated really by Fred there, going round and getting the crowd all excited. They'd played the post-horn gallop before the players came out, and there's a massive sort of din just as the players sort of entered the field of play. The other thing I wanted to say as well about Charles Wells, because I mentioned them earlier, and I know a lot of people have got a sort of big thing against Charles Wells, who owned the land all the way through, and the fact that it was them that meant that we couldn't sort of carry on playing. I mean, there were lots of things with the lease where the Eagles actually had a lot of leeway with it, and the one thing we did, even if they actually took the land, which meant that we couldn't play there anymore, Bedford Town actually nicked their logo from Charles Wells. And I'll just prove it actually with a few slides. Right, so there we have sort of 1970s. It's the Eagle Bitter logo. You sort of notice the eagle there very prominently. And 1976, their centenary of brewing. The eagle is still there. 1977, Bedford Town had nicked the eagle, but there wasn't anything in the middle. And then this is sort of a year before the team actually finished. We've nicked the whole logo and stick a football in the middle. And that, to this day, that is actually Bedford Town's official badge. That's right, yeah, we actually got to the semi-final of the FA Trophy 75, 76, and we lost, we lost both legs of the semi-final, in fact, so we were fairly well slaughtered, but it was just one step from Bedford actually playing at Wembley Stadium. It was against Scarborough. Yeah. The season before, we got to the quarterfinals and played Morecambe, and we got a little bit of fame actually that year because we were on grandstand. Even though we lost in the quarterfinals, it was the first ever streaker at a football match. It was just down the road. Wasn't as cold as it was tonight, so don't worry too much about his health, but you know, it went down in history as being the first streaker at a football match was actually over the Eagles. I'm sure the ladies in the audience remember it well. Yeah, we lost. It's a few words, we lost. It was 3-0 to Everton. Went down in history as our biggest ever attendance, over 18,000. I think quite a few went over the wall as well, so we're probably talking nearer 19,000. It was on Match of the Day that night. That year is 1966, obviously, when we won the World Cup. One of the World Cup team was actually playing for Everton that day, full-back, and Everton actually went on to win the FA Cup, having knocked us out in the early rounds. So we can at least say we got knocked out by the team that went on to win it. So, again, another little claim to fame. You know, I think we're running just a bit short on time, so if there's no more questions, like I say, feel free to nab us once it's over. If you've got a burning question, I can show you the person that used to get drunk in the pub, because I did miss that one out. He is on that team photo. So thanks a lot for coming, and I'll just hand you over to Pam to round things off, yeah? Okay, thanks.